is the Oral History of Social Work in Canada project, and today we're interviewing Mr. Joseph Grandy. Mr. Grandy, in order to begin, I wonder if you could tell us where you were born and when, and a little bit about your early family life.
Yes, I was born in Halifax in 1914, and I'm the oldest of five. I'm the oldest of 6 boys in our family. During the Halifax explosion, which occurred in 1917, I had a piece of glass cut my eye, and my sight has been rather, well, not too good. But I'm not visually handicapped or anything, but it's been a bit of a problem. During the early years, I lived with my parents in the north end of Halifax, and my father died when I was 14 years of age, which necessitated the breaking up of our family. There were no social assistance programs in those days, which would have kept the family together. And I went to live with an aunt who lived across 5 miles away from my home across the Arm. My other brothers went into an orphanage in Halifax. So after living with my aunt till I was about 18 or 19 years of age, I went back to school. I had left school, I was in grade 9, and went back to school and continued until I got into junior college. And at that point in time, the war broke out, and I went in the Navy, where I stayed until 1945, came out as a petty officer, and I decided then I had to do something about a career, so I took some testing courses and what have you, and it showed that I should get into the field of social services. And I looked into that matter and discovered that the Maritime School of Social Work had just recently begun in Halifax. I think it was in 42 they had started, and this was 45. So I was fortunate enough to get into the school that year and continued there for 2 years and started to work with the Department of Social Services in 1947. My early life wasn't easy. During the Depression years, things were really tough. But I survived it like all the rest of us. Well, here we are now. I'm graduated from the School of Social Work, and the decision was where to go to work. And the munificent salaries at that time, the beginning salary was $2,100 a year. And it makes me smile today when I think of the difference that there is. However, the cost of living certainly wasn't as high. But it wasn't easy going through the school and then starting off, and I was married and had a family of 2 children at that time. And it wasn't too easy in those early days. However, enough about me. Let's talk about the social work end of my career.
Okay. I did want to ask if your career in the military had any effect on your later career as a social worker.
Well, not really. I don't suppose it would have had too much influence, really. I was in the Navy, and of course, it's a little different than being in the battle front, I suppose. I spent a good deal of time down south doing patrol work, and we got involved in a couple of incidents, but I don't think that that would have influenced my career too much, really, in social work.
During the time you were at the School of Social Work, what kinds of courses did you have?
Oh my God. There were courses upon courses. As a matter of fact, there were 17 courses in the first year. And I'm sure there were just as many in the second year. Now, I think that in the early days, the idea that they had at the school was that the more courses you had, the better the school would be. And we had everything from birth control, contraceptive courses to well, you name it, athletic courses, and God only knows what else. However, I think the idea was okay in that we had a really broad background in the field. We had such a variety of teachers. They were from all walks of life, from the medical profession right through the legal profession, and there were some social work people, and a lot of the professors were only part-timers. Weren't too many full-time people at the school at the time.
Among the professors that you had, are there any that stand out in your mind?
Well, of course, Dr. Fred McKinnon, he was probably the one that had the most impact on me. He taught public welfare administration and also statistics and statistics and research. And Phyllis Burns, who was the casework teacher, was very prominent, and I felt that she was very helpful and just a wonderful person. And of course there was Miss Shand, who was a real lady. She wouldn't even let anyone know what your mark was. she would put on this little slip of paper and pass it to you. If you had a B or a C, nobody knew. Very interesting old lady.
What about your fellow students?
Yeah. I think there was a class of 6 or 7. George Hart, who later became assistant director of child welfare with the province of Nova Scotia, and subsequently his career went into the field of in Montreal. He went to Montreal, and in the field of raising money for the community chest, and he became quite good at this, apparently, and known in Canada for this. And George also wrote some historical material for the province, which was very interesting. And George and I, of course, were the only 2 males. The other 4 were females. That's an interesting point, because in the days prior to then, the social work profession, especially here, I don't know about anywhere else, it was all women. There were no men in the field at all. And as a matter of fact, when people would ask me, what are you doing? And I would say, I'm in social work. They didn't have a clue about what social work was. And it used to take me 15 minutes to try to explain to them what I was doing. But subsequent to that time, the men started to come in. As a matter of fact, when I started to work with the department, with the exception of a few males working in the administrative side, the workers were all female workers.
Did that have any effect on you, doing what was called, or what's now called, women's work?
Yes, I think it had a little effect on me. I felt embarrassed at times, but it was only for a very short period of time because I got used to it. It was just like water off the duck's back after a while. It didn't bother me a bit because I felt that, we were doing a job that sex has nothing to do with, really.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When you finished your career, oh, I'm sorry, I did want to ask you one more question about school field placements.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, my field placements were very interesting. In the first year, I was in the mental health setting, where with Dr. Jones, who was the head of the Department of Psychiatry. And in those early days, we used to give shock treatments, and I can recall being petrified there, holding patients down while we were giving these shock treatments to them. I was most interested in psychiatric, in the field of psychiatric social work at that time, and thought that when I graduated that I might like to work in this particular field. However, the opportunity didn't arise because in those days, in the psychiatric hospital, there wasn't even one social worker on the staff. And it was only years later that they began to hire social workers in the hospitals. Then I had another placement in the juvenile delinquency field, which I subsequently got into on a permanent basis, and I think I had a very valuable field experience there under Judge Hudson, who was quite famous here, and I think I learned a great deal there.
What kind of thing did you learn?
Well, I learned how to deal with kids, and I had them on probation to me, and I thought it was just a great experience. And from there, I really took off into the field when I graduated.
Mm-hmm. How did it happen that you began work with the department?
Yeah, I was a veteran, as you know, and I had applied to the Department of Veterans Affairs for a placement. And Jim Lovett was the director here, and he wanted me. He wanted a veteran who had graduated in social work to deal with veterans who were coming out into their programs. And they had a list of people who are not veterans, and he wired Ottawa asking them for permission to hire a veteran not on the eligible list. And of course, Ottawa takes its time in answering a question such as that. And in the meantime, I had to have a job. So I applied also to the provincial department. And I went to see Mr. Ernest Blois, who was the first deputy minister of the Department of Social Services. And he said, you can have a job here at $1,900 a year. And I said, well, I have a wife and family, and I said, I can get $2,100 with the federal government. And I said, I have to think about that. And he said, I told those guys that we were going to lose people if we didn't get the salaries up around here. And he said, leave it with me and I'll give you a call on the weekend. And of course I was jittery because I had, at that point, I just didn't have any income at all. And the first one who came through, I was going to go. And Dr. Blois called me, I think the following Monday, and said I could have the job at $2,100, and I jumped down. I went in a hurry. So Who knows? I could have been with the Fids.
Yeah. Would have been a different career.
Would have been quite different, I'm sure.
A
Yeah.
different story.
Yes, indeed.
What was your first job?
Well, the first job was in the child welfare field. You have to understand at the outset the way the department had just been organized in 1944. Prior to that, different parts of legislation would be in different departments of government, like the Attorney General's Department would have one thing, and the Health Department would have another, and so on. So in 1944, the department had become organized as the Department of Health and Welfare. That was his first designation. So I arrived on the scene in 47, and you had to be competent in every field, or at least they thought you had to be competent, and you had a very generalized caseload. And while they might have said you're going to work in child welfare, the very next day you might be doing a mother's allowance report, or even an old age pension report. And there were other things in those days called dependent board of trustee reports, which were for the federal government. We do these things. Or you might even be doing an adoption. So you had a mixed bag of tricks, although I was deemed to be in the Department of Child Welfare. And that, I think, was the most difficult area for me. I, as I mentioned, had been married, and I was very keen about family life. And to see neglected children and to have to bring children into court as neglected was a very hard thing for me to do. I used to go to court, bringing the children to court and praying that the judge would turn the thing down, because I hated to see the children being taken from the families. Even though the families were pretty poor families, I still felt that foster home placement and institutional life was not a much better alternative.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that was the first thing. I got into the child welfare field and did adoptions for about 3 or 4 years, I guess. And at that point, I got into the delinquency business. I was appointed as a probation officer in the Halifax court.
Mm-hmm.
And from there, I rose to the munificent position of supervisor of corrections for the province. I don't know, that came about in the 50s sometime. I can't recall the date now.
Mm-hmm.
And during that time, I felt that I made a little bit of contribution in this field because we were pretty backward. One has to understand the business of the Elizabethan Poor Laws about all these programs. We were plagued, and we're plagued on the east coast of Canada and the United States with these Elizabethan Poor Laws, which came from 1601 in Britain, and when the people landed, this was the only kind of method that they knew about dealing with the poor and the problems in social welfare. Now the problem, of course, was the fact that under the Elizabethan Poor Laws, the smallest unit was responsible for looking after these people, which is known in England as a parish. Over here, they were known as poor districts. And I can recall that there were well over 200, I think 250 odd, of these districts in Nova Scotia at the time. when
At what time?
at the time when I joined the department, and it wasn't until 1955 that the municipalities became responsible. So what you had was an overseer of the poor in a district, well, the size of, say, Herring Cove outside of Halifax here, which would have about a couple of hundred families in it. And if a family there became destitute, it would be up, and each place had an overseer of the poor. It would be up to that overseer to either to grant that person assistance or to withhold it. And more often than not, they withheld it because they had a very limited budget. And it wasn't until, I think, 55 that the municipalities, it changed so that I think there were 18 municipalities in Nova Scotia. So you reduced from 200 odd down to that. So that made things a little better. And then with the improvement of the legislation, where the federal government shared with the provincial government 66 2/3%, the municipality only had to come up with a third. It made things an awful lot better and a lot easier.
Can we go back for just a second to the poor districts? Where would the poor districts, the overseers, where would they get the money from to give assistance to the poor?
Well, they would tax the individual families in their district, you see, to give it to these needy people.
Mm-hmm.
And more often than not, if it was a poor area, people were living at the poverty line anyway, so that there was very little that they could do to help the others, you see.
Were there institutions for the poor at that time?
Yeah, they were something else. Started off in the early days, they were known as the workhouses. They became known as county homes. And almost every county had one of these. And there was an awful admixture in there. There were the mentally ill, the retarded, the poor, the maimed, and the poor souls of society, all mingled, children, adults, and all mingled together. And this was probably the biggest mess that had to be cleaned up, and which was cleaned up in the 50s again under Dr. McKinnon and Dr. Clyde Marshall, Department of Health. And we determined, I used to visit these places, and it would make you almost sick to see the conditions under which these poor souls lived. What happened in the end was that they chose a half a dozen, or 3 or 4 of the best ones, and they called them mental hospitals. And they tried to keep the mental patients in there, and then we removed the children and got them out into other children's institutions. And the others that remained, most of which were abandoned, and there was a half a dozen of the better ones kept. And this is the way the picture is today. It's a much better situation, but it is a horrible situation.
Again, when you started that first job, how would the people who were your clients fit in with that system? Or
Well, the problem was, when in early social work, you had so little resources that you were taxed almost in every case that you had to the very limit of your ability to try to find some kind of a solution. And if it was monetary, it was almost hopeless. Now, many of the children and the adults had to be placed in these county homes as a result of the fact that there was no other alternative for them. I'm sure some of them were close, came very close to starvation in those days, in the early days. I don't know, and prior to my time, I'm sure during the Depression, many of them must have starved. But there were so little resources, and that's when social work was tough. And later on, and you know, it was such a blessing when we got these new programs, like the Mother's Allowance only came into existence in 1930, I think, in this province. And that was the beginning of things. And then you had old age, you had the old age pension, which was 75%, I think, paid for by the federal government and 25% by the province. And that was a big step forward. That came, I can't recall the dates, but they had just been in existence a very short time, I think, prior to the war. But that was what made social work difficult. The resources weren't there. You had no way to help people except by encouragement, by, well, you would plead their cases sometimes before these overseers of the poor and before the courts and so on to try to get some sort of a deal for them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How would kids become part of your caseload?
What would happen in the child welfare aspect, the complaints would be brought into the department that, you know, such and such a family existing in such and such a place are neglecting their children. They're out all night, and the children are alone, and they're not being cared for. So this meant you went to do an investigation. And often as not, you would find the children alone. The husband may be out working, and the wife often gone somewhere. I recall one incident where I had to go 10 miles to get the mother, and she was down there with some fiddler down there 10 miles away and playing around with this fellow, and I had to try to use every means of persuasion that I could to get that woman to come back to look after her children. When fortunately she did come with me and saved me grief for that night. But you see, that would be a temporary thing, and next week the same story, you'd get the same story again, and it would happen, and you'd have to apprehend the children. And this is how they got on your caseload.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever have the experience of kids becoming part of your caseload for things like truancy or
Oh, yeah.
other?
Yes, as a matter of fact, that's very interesting. When I was in the delinquency field, truancy, they had there was a truant officer in the city of Halifax, and I think if the kid missed, I think it was 5 consecutive days out of school, he could be brought before the juvenile court and charged with truancy. And as a matter of fact, there were many children brought before the court who wound up in the reform schools. You know, and they were in there with all the hardened delinquents, the fellows that you know, were bashing people over the head and stealing and what have you. And these little kids, some of whom were quite innocent, because the reason they didn't get to school was because of inclement weather, poor clothing, and poor food, and you know, there were desperate situations, and snowstorms and everything, but they didn't take these things into consideration. If and the Department of Education and the Department of Social Services were miles apart. I used to try to get them to understand the situation, but no, sir. They had to have their pound of flesh. It was a very, very poor situation. And in that business, I think I should mention the fact that there were 4 reform schools. There was 2 for girls, 2 for boys, 2 Roman Catholic institutions, and 2 Protestant institutions. And of course, they ran it was a very moralistic approach that they took. I recall when I was the supervisor of corrections at the time, when the Protestant one in Halifax decided that they were going out of business, this meant that the province of Nova Scotia had to take over the reform school. And I was very much involved in that. As a matter of fact, the first director of the Maritime School of Social Work, Lawrence Hancock, was the superintendent we chose to take over. But I recall going there, and we didn't know any more about running a reform school than we knew about rocket firing from Cape Canaveral. But anyway, we muddled through that. That was in September, I think September, the time, you know, I forget the dates. I think it was 48 or 49 or something like that. And then subsequently, the others fell by the wayside, and now there are only 2, which are one for boys and one for girls, which are both operated by the provincial government.
Why did the Protestant churches decide that it was time to get out of the business of running a reform school?
Yeah, the cost was the biggest factor. In the early days, I think people used to, well, the salaries weren't high, and that was one thing. And when salaries started to go up, and costs, food costs, and so on, it became such an enormous burden for them that they just couldn't bear it any longer, really. That's what happened. And the buildings, of course, were old and falling apart, and it would have meant rebuilding, and they didn't have that kind of money to do it with. And the government, the government would say, well, you build your building first, and then we'll talk to you about subsidies after. And they'd say, oh no, you give us a grant, and then we'll build a building. And this went on and went on, and then the first thing you know, they decided enough of this, and that's how the province got taken for, or not taken, I mean they had to get into the business of running the reform schools.
Was there any kind of community or public comment or incentive to government taking over the reform schools?
Oh yeah, there were many editorials written about them at the time, but I don't think there was any great, there wasn't any great commotion about it, really. I think that it was understood that it was quite a costly venture, although from a religious point of view, people wondered now, how are these poor children going to get their religious education in these schools run by the government, you know. But that's about all the comment there was about it.
Could you describe the programs that were available for kids who came into the juvenile corrections system at the time?
Yeah, well, there were, you got to understand that there were juvenile courts in Halifax, Cape Breton, in Windsor, and New Glasgow, I think, and maybe Amherst. Now, that leaves a great deal of the province uncovered, so that the children in those areas, see, you were using the Juvenile Delinquents Act in cases where the juvenile courts existed, but in the other places, they used the adult courts. And judges had to be specially authorized to hear the cases, but they were treated like adults. You know, the cases were dealt with just like you would deal with an adult criminal. And probably the one thing that I feel that I contributed something to was the development of juvenile courts and family courts throughout the entire province of Nova Scotia. I think if there's one thing in my career that I feel that I did something about, it was that. I recall one incident, probably that brought about, I think I should tell the story because I don't think you can understand it unless I do. I got a call. See, little children would come before the courts, 7, 8, 9 years of age. And we were operating the school for boys. We'd taken over, and that was located down in Shelburne, which is 150 miles from Halifax. Now, the person responsible for bringing a child from the court to the reform school was the sheriff. And on this particular day, Jessie Casey, a social worker with the department, called me and said that there's a 7-year-old boy being held in the county jail. And she said to me, the sheriff won't take him until tomorrow. That meant that he would have to stay in this horrible county jail overnight. So I said, there's no way that I'm going to permit this. And of course, I told Jessie to get a car and to take him herself. Well, that started a commotion, and of course, the press got a hold of it. They came to me, or they phoned me, and asked me what had happened, and I told them the facts. And I said, and I made some comment, I said, oh, how was it now? No, I guess the kid was in Dartmouth, that's right. And I said, this wouldn't happen in Halifax where there's a juvenile court. You know, and I said, the judge, you know, it's up to the judge to make sure that kid gets down to Shelburne. And all hell broke loose about this because I was accused of quoting the law and not being a lawyer. And the Attorney General got upset, and the judge who had placed the kid in custody was wild, called the deputy minister, and I had been away that day, and they couldn't reach me the following day. And anyway, this row stirred up such a commotion, I think, that this had the biggest influence in the development of the juvenile court system through the entire province of Nova Scotia.
What happened then after this commotion about the 7-year-old? Could you go through what you did to help these the juvenile and family courts develop further?
Yeah, well, yes, you can't really do anything without legislative backing, and that's what you had to do. You had to get the legislators. I mean, we were trying to do things, such as I did, through the back door to help the kids and to keep things on an even keel. But without the legislative changes, there's no way that you could do much, really, other than to help as best you could.
So in order to get legislative backing for the juvenile and family courts, how did you, who were on the inside of the system, go about that?
Well, we certainly studied the picture in other parts of Canada. For example, Dr. McKinnon, again, was very certainly responsible. It was the one area, see, everything seemed to be progressing very well in the department, except in this particular field. Corrections was sort of, well, slowed down for some reason, while the other things pushed ahead. And, but eventually, Dr. McKinnon and those of the rest of us worked on this thing and got probably through a change of ministers who became sympathetic toward it, maybe who were lawyers. I can't quite remember why, but we were able anyway to bring about the change. And then following that, the family court aspect followed along
Through that.
and that's when I got out. That's when I left the provincial department then, went to the health field.
Well, perhaps that's a good place to stop
Yeah.
and take a break then.
Good.
Okay.
Fair enough. Are we doing all right?
We're resuming our interview today with Mr. Joe Grandy. We've been talking about Mr. Grandy's work in the juvenile corrections field. I wonder if we could go back to that for just a minute, Mr. Grandy. And I'd like to ask you about who the clients were that you were dealing with when you were working in juvenile corrections.
Well, the children that came before the courts were usually children between 8 and 16 years of age, many of whom were brought before the court for theft. This, of course, was the greatest delinquency. A number were there for truancy, as I mentioned before. But the great majority were 13 and 14-year-olds who were involved in some kind of theft or related situation. Usually, we would do an assessment of the case. The child would be given to you as your case to investigate, and then you would come back to the court with your recommendation to the judge about the disposition that he should make. Oftentimes the judge would disagree with your disposition, with the disposition that you would make, but by and large they would usually follow. And what we would do normally on a first offense was get the child placed on probation. And we carried the child probably for 6 months or even up to a year on probation, and counsel him at least once a week during this period. Now, if he got into further difficulty, he came back before the judge and oftentimes was committed to one of the reform schools.
If a
Yes,
Go ahead.
well, I think we should mention the Children's Aid Societies, which we haven't mentioned up to this point, and they were involved quite heavily. There are Children's Aid Societies, I think there are 12 throughout the province, and they were quite involved in the delinquency and child welfare field, and many of the children used to be placed on probation to those people in the Children's Aid Societies as well.
If a child did go to reform school, what kind of program would exist at that time?
Yeah, well, there was development, considerable development. At the time when we took over the Halifax Industrial School in 1947, I think it was 47 or 48. At that point, I went, along with others, on trips across in different parts of the States and Canada to learn about programs for the reform schools. And I think we developed in the Nova Scotia School for Boys one of the best in Canada, really, from what I could see after having visited these places, and other people from other parts of Canada and the United States who have come here have found it remarkable that they had such a program. First of all, there's an academic program. The children follow the usual school curriculum in there. And then there's recreational programs. There's programs of all kinds in terms of counseling. There was a social worker there, always at the school, and there were many others on the staff who were involved with the boys on a one-to-one basis, and developed quite a relationship. And so much so that I think that the recidivism rate for our school was as low or lower than any place in Canada, which I found quite interesting, since we were pioneers in the field, so to speak.
Yes. About the clients, again, Halifax has always had a fair number of black people among its
Oh,
population.
yes.
How were they represented in your caseload?
Yeah, well, I suppose it would be 10% might be colored children. See, Nova Scotia, of course, is unique in this respect, in that I think in Canada we have the highest number of blacks in any place. And there are 4 or 5 areas. There was, well, the Africville area, which no longer exists, and which we're not sitting too far from, as a matter of fact, right now. And that was something that the Department of Social Services became involved in. It was a shack town, and the Department of Social Services employed Mr. Peter McDonald from Sydney, who successfully was able to get rid of this horrible place. Then across the harbor in Dartmouth, there's a big community over there, and there are 2 or 3 other pockets in the province where there are colored children. And of course, if you listen, if you read Dr. Oliver's book, Dr. Oliver is the spokesman. He's a clergyman and for the black people, and he mentions that the blacks, it wasn't as though they were oppressed, all right, but they were looked upon as poor, you know, that they just couldn't rise above their poverty. Well, I think things have changed certainly immensely in the last few years. But in those early days, the families of these poor blacks, they were really at the bottom of the barrel, and the children, you know, got into more difficulty because of this, I think.
How about the number of female children that you were dealing with in your department?
The ratio was usually 10 to 1, 1 girl for every 10 boys. As I said, there were 2 reform schools, one for girls, a Protestant denomination, which was in Truro, and one for the Catholics in Halifax, and they would have a capacity of about 45 apiece, something like that. Where the boys' schools, there were a couple of hundred in the boys' schools.
You mentioned that the boys were most often sent to the reform school for theft. How did the girls, what kinds of offenses had the girls committed?
Usually for promiscuous behavior. I think that for promiscuity, first of all, some for theft, of course, and some for just, when I say promiscuous behavior, they would run away from home and just rebellion. That's about what it was. And it was the only way to deal with it, was to put them in a reform school. People, there were no services. You know, there was no, for example, like there was no halfway houses or foster home type place where you could place a girl, you know, who couldn't get along with her family, such as there are today. And that's why they would wind up in these reform schools, and sometimes would spend a year, even 2, in these places.
During the time that you were in juvenile corrections, what about the challenges that you faced during that time?
Yeah, there are many of them. It used to be very discouraging because of the limited resources. You would try so hard to work with these kids and try to to gain, the only way that you could get anywhere was try to gain their understanding. I guess my mic fell off here. To try to get them, you know, to look upon you as a friend. And if you couldn't do that, then the ball game was over, because they just looked upon you as another arm of the law, like a cop or something like that. We tried not to identify with the police. We tried to be, and that was a difficult thing to do, because no matter what you did, they would always assume that you were on the other side. You know, you weren't on their side. You were on the side of the court and the side of the. But we would try. That was probably the most difficult challenge, to try to get the kids to understand that we were trying to befriend them and to help them. Now, we were successful, I suppose, in half the cases.
I had said that would be the last question on that, but another one's just occurred to me. I hope you don't mind if we stick with it. What kind of preventive programs in the area of juvenile delinquency, juvenile corrections, existed then in the late 40s and early 50s?
Well, there weren't too many. I think a few clubs. There were a few boys' clubs in the area where kids could go for recreational purposes. And then the police boys' club was developed a little later on, and I think this was certainly a very good thing. But there weren't all that many preventive things that I can think of, really, other than those very minimal ones.
The idea of street workers and social workers detached from a main
No,
office.
that hadn't, we used to hear about this being done in New York City, for example, but it never came to fruition here.
Okay, then you left the juvenile corrections field. Why did you leave, and where did you go?
Well, at the time, it seems that in the Department of Social Services, all they have to do is place their hands on your head, and then they turn you into something else. You know, you move from field to field, and the assumption is, you know, I was in the teaching field. They just said to me, go to the Maritime School and teach this course, or go to the Institute of Technology and teach this course, or go out and teach the nurses this or something, and off you would go. And I had never had 1 hour of teacher training in my life. But this is the way it is in the department, and that's the way it used to be then, and to a lesser degree now, because there's specialization today. People, if you're going into the delinquency field, that's what you do, and you stay with it. Or if you go into mental health, you go there and you stay in it. But it so happened that there was a problem between the Department of Health and the Department of Social Services got together, because they were having a problem at the Nova Scotia Hospital in maintaining the social work staff there. There was some problem, I don't know, people were leaving and they couldn't seem to manage it. So the Department of Health asked the Department of Social Services to take over the responsibility of the social services in that hospital. Because the Department of Social Services is the biggest employer of social workers in the area, they assumed that they could feel quite sure that they would be able to supply them with workers. So this happened, and a predecessor of mine, George Matthews, went there, and he was there, I think, for a year or so. And one day, the deputy minister said to me, I want you to go to the Nova Scotia Hospital to take over the directorship of the Social Service Department. Well, in fear and trembling, I I went. I think there was an inducement of $1,000 in the salary or something. That's probably the only reason I would have gone. But anyway, I went in fear and trembling, as I say, because I had been out of the field for so long. However, as I said in the early part of the interview, I was always interested, very much interested in psychiatric social work. So it didn't take me long to get it back into the jargon. I learned what schizophrenia was all about in a very short while. And I had a staff of 20 people over there, 20 social workers, and we had quite, I think, a good social service department. As a matter of fact, I was very proud of that department over there, I think, and I'm sure that the doctors and those people in charge over there were very happy with the social work program. In fact, I don't know how that hospital could ever operate without the social service background that it has in the input that it has. I mean, the psychiatrists, yes, they are very necessary, but I'm sure that the social service department is just as necessary. They do very wonderful things.
What is the job of the social workers and the social services department in that institution for the psychiatrically disabled?
Yeah, well, of course, you have to. It's a complicated situation because there's so many different divisions and parts. For instance, there's a children's service over there where the social worker is very much involved with the children and families and in the treatment process. The social worker meets with the psychiatrist, and she sees that the program, the treatment program, is put into effect for that child and the family, and works with the family very closely. Now that's one area. Then there's the geriatric department, social work over there. Social worker deals with the relatives and like nobody else can, really, because there's nobody can deal with relatives like a social worker. I mean, we're trained in that way. And even some psychiatrists are not too good at this. And then there's the teenage group there, people, drug addiction people, involved with drugs and difficulties and overdoses and this and that. And the social worker, again, deals with the treatment of these kids and is very close to in the treatment team. She's one of the kingpins. And so it goes in all the different areas in that hospital. And then there's the general group, you know, the schizophrenics and the depressed people. Again, she's involved with the families. And it's the family and the relationship between the patient and their families. That's the important key in the treatment process there, I think.
How about discharge planning and things like that?
Yeah.
Was that something?
Yes. That's very interesting that you should mention that, because I think I developed the discharge planning process over there. I think that is probably one of the biggest input that the social work department has over there. I forgot about it for the moment, but that is one of the biggest things. There are steps in the discharge planning, and it starts from the day that the patient arrives in the hospital. The social worker starts to plan right from that moment the discharge date and the time, and works toward the placement of the patient. Sometimes it may be to another institution, sometimes it's to home, sometimes it's to a halfway house. Each individual case, of course, as you'll understand, is different, but that discharge planning is the most effective part of the job that they do, I think.
You had mentioned, I believe, that you had done one of your field placements at the Nova Scotia Hospital.
Well, not really at the Nova Scotia Hospital. It was in a clinic. It was a mental health clinic, and it was in the Halifax side. And at that time, as I said, when I graduated in 1947, there wasn't one social worker at the Nova Scotia Hospital. And I can recall being at a meeting where the boss of that hospital was asked by a psychiatrist why he didn't have a social service department. He said, "I have enough trouble reading the reports of the psychiatrist. I couldn't wade through social work reports."
Too much paperwork.
Yeah.
During the time between the time you had done the field placement in the clinic and the time you went back, or not back, but went back into the field of psychiatric social work, what changes did you see in that field over the years?
Oh, I think things were a little more sophisticated in the way that they dealt with people. Certainly the use of well, the psychiatric drugs had come about, and many of these wonder drugs have, well, made things quite different. In the old days, they had to rely on very primitive measures, and one of which, of course, was electroshock, and which was repulsive to many people, and well, the row still goes on about it. However, I have seen excellent results from it, and while they don't know how it works or how it comes about, they know that it causes loss of memory, but that's only for a temporary period. But I've seen very depressed people come out of it and be quite normal. But I think that the advent of the new psychiatric drugs was the big difference. So you could see patients who would normally, in those early days, used to have long-term patients. Well, those patients don't exist anymore today. Well, I mean, they exist, but they're not in the numbers that they were in those days. Some of these chronic mental hospitals, you know, there were hundreds and hundreds of these patients. Well, today, well, there's just a handful because of the drugs. They can be maintained. I mean, it's beautiful psychiatric drugs.
Was there, during that period, a move in the area of community-based mental health activities?
Yes. As a matter of fact, I think that Nova Scotia was in the forefront in that field, really. We have mental health centers throughout the province now, and that was developed back about 20 years ago. And when it was you know, and I can remember reading the literature when they were talking about it coming to pass in the United States, and we were way ahead of them. Yeah, there were mental health centers. They're throughout the province now. There's one in Sydney. There's one in Glasgow. There's, of course, there's one in Halifax, Yarmouth, Digby, and so on. They're all over, and some of them cover 2 counties, but they usually are county-wide based, you know. And to get psychiatrists, they never thought that they'd ever get the psychiatrist to go to these places, but they have, and they've done a remarkable job. And as a result, I see the Nova Scotia Hospital is the admitting hospital for the entire province, you see. And I think it has certainly cut down on the number of admissions, you know, having the community-based mental health services.
And on discharge, what kinds of services are available in the community?
Well, on discharge now, for example, there's the public health nurses. They are involved in it. But in the main, they will go to the community-based mental health center, and this is where they will get their medication, and they will see the psychiatrists and the social workers in those places. And I think that's a real fine backup service for the mentally ill.
Is there, in some provinces, housing for ex-psychiatric patients is a real critical issue.
Yeah.
Has that been a consideration in Nova Scotia?
No, they had some problems with it, but there are 2 or 3 of those halfway houses, I think they refer to them as. There's certainly one in Dartmouth, and there's certainly one in Halifax. I think there's probably one in Cape Breton, and I don't know about the other parts of the province. Since I've been out of it now for 5 or 6 years, there could have been developments that I don't know about, but certainly those halfway houses certainly have proven to be quite helpful, and I'm sure there's only one way to go, and that's to get more of those.
What about the challenges that faced you in that job in psychiatric social work?
Well, I think one of the biggest problems, of course, was to, you see, when you're dealing with another profession, and it almost seems like you're subservient to the medical profession. The medical profession, of course, are the big boys, and they wield the tools. However, the problem was in dealing with these medical doctors to try to get them to understand the role of social work, and that probably was my biggest problem. I recall when I first arrived there, there was a German doctor, and of course, when he spoke, everyone stood at attention. It was like a Gestapo, so I was only there a week, and he came roaring into my office, and I couldn't understand him. He spoke with quite an accent, and I said, "All right, doctor, let's settle down now for a minute and talk about this." And I couldn't understand him for a while. Now, what the problem was that we used to sit down at rounds. After round, the doctors make rounds, they'd come to the conference table, and all the social workers used to sit around with the doctors, and they would discuss cases, and about this one would have to be sent to the hospital in Halifax to have something looked at, or this or that. And this doctor felt that these social workers should be there at this meeting. And my predecessor had gone against his wishes and had sent one individual there, and that one individual would take the message and give it to the other social workers, you see, leave it on her desk. Well, oftentimes, she wouldn't get back to her desk to get the message, and the woman who would have to go to the hospital didn't get there. Well, all hell used to break loose, see. And this is what he complained about. Well, I said to myself, it's a very small matter. I can arrange for them to go, and I insisted that the social workers be present, and they had no more problems with the guy. But these are the kinds of things that you had to deal with these doctors to get them to understand what we in social work try to do, what we're capable of doing. And I'm so pleased to tell you that some doctors who didn't have much use for social workers came back and told me many times that they were very pleased with what this particular social worker had accomplished with such and such a patient. And it used to make me feel pretty good.
Sure, indeed it would. Indeed it would.
Well, they're very difficult to deal with, those psychiatrists, I'll tell you.
Over the years that you were in practice as a social worker, did you have, what kind of involvements did you have with other organizations?
Well, I was involved with the Children's Aid Societies in that you see, they used to get their program, they used to get funded by the provincial government. They would give them matching grants. If they would raise $1,000, well, the provincial government would give them another $1,000. So one of my jobs was to encourage them to get around to those societies. I used to have to go speak to the societies and the boards of each individual society to try to get them, to encourage them to raise money to improve their own, it was for their own benefit, of course. I was certainly involved with them. While I was in, you couldn't help but get involved. As you know, social workers, they're always after you to attend this or attend that, and I was involved with a number of things in the community, certainly. But yeah, I was in the Association of Social Workers. I at one time was the, well, I was the you call it a project planner or something. Used to have to put the meetings on in various places to make them make them a little different. We used to try to have different settings. You know, we'd have one at a Chinese restaurant, for example, so we had Chinese food, see if we could drag more people out and various things like this.
Yeah.
But I was with them for a while until I got disillusioned. I felt that I wasn't getting anywhere, but I did serve my time.
Mm-hmm. Why did you get disillusioned with the association?
Oh, I don't know. I felt that it was just the people that were, you know, at the top. I felt that they were going in the wrong direction, in the opposite direction than I would expect them to go in, and they would get into petty arguments and about, you know, someone would get appointed to a job, and because he didn't have an MSW, you'd think it was the end of the world, you know, this kind of thing. I thought it was unnecessary for them to be so picky.
So they were worried about professional education and
Development and education, yeah, right.
What did you think they should be doing?
No, I think that they should be looking toward professional development. I'm not saying that they shouldn't be concerned with that, but I think the projects that they chose to do were sometimes infantile and silly, that's all. And they could have been doing more, you know, more things to develop the image of social work. I felt that they were their own worst enemies in trying. Maybe they were trying. I don't think you get an image by standing up on a pedestal and screaming out, "I'm a professional social worker. Look at me." That is not the way to do it. And this is the way, it seems to me, that they were going about things. You know, it wouldn't matter. They were negativistic about everything that seemed to go on. Now, I'm not saying everyone was like that, but at that particular time, I just got fed up with it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't want you to take offense, because I just felt that that's the way it was at the time, you know, and it's probably a lot better now, you know. They
Yeah.
get probably learned from this experience.
Exactly, and that's why I asked the question.
Yeah.
Not that I would take offense, but so that we can learn about
Yeah.
the development of the profession.
That's right.
Were you at all involved in the development of the local office of the Canadian Mental Health Association?
Well, I was, yeah, Andy Crook. You see, we used to hold meetings at our hospital all the time, and you know, with them. So I was quite close to them, but not in the beginning. I wasn't involved at the start of things. No, I wasn't in the field at the time. That was.
Oh, I see. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When you left the Nova Scotia Hospital,
Oh, yeah.
why did you leave?
Okay, I left to become social work consultant for the province. This meant the purpose of this was to try to develop social work departments in the hospitals, both physical and mental hospitals throughout the province. There were only there were very few hospitals. On the physical side, like the VG Hospital, which is the big provincial hospital, had a social work department. The infirmary in Halifax had a social work department, but it was small. And other than that, there were very few hospitals throughout the province that had social work departments. And we tried, one of the things was to try to develop social work departments within the hospital, and we had some success. I was only 5 years in that job, and we had some success in developing social service departments, and as a matter of fact, you know, developing the size. For instance, one social worker dealing with the unmarried mothers in the city of Halifax, which seemed to me to be a little ridiculous, and at least I was able to get another social worker in there. And, you know, this was mainly my job, and to keep them informed. You see, the problem with social work, I think, is that if you're out, it's okay if you're if you're in the big city, in the center, you meet with other social workers, you can discuss, and you hear what's going on. But you're out in the boondocks in a hospital 200 miles away, you're all alone there. They like to have someone visit, and this was one part of my job, which I felt was a kind of a public relations sort of a job, and to let them know what was going on in the field and so on.
Mm-hmm. What would hold you back from getting more social work departments going?
Well, money mainly, budgetary considerations. What you'd have to do, you have to plan ahead. You can't. It's no use going to an administrator in a hospital and saying, "Look, hire a social worker because you know, this girl's worked to death." You can say, "Well, I don't have any money in the budget." Well, the idea is to get the money in the budget for next year, so you harp on it, you know, for a year or two, and then you finally bring it about. This is what I used to have to do. So.
When you stopped being the consultant, the social work consultant for the province, was that for your retirement?
Yeah, 1979. That's when I retired.
And what have you been doing since then?
Having fun, playing a lot of golf. Don't play it in the wintertime, but I certainly play a lot of it in the summer. And enjoying myself. Yeah. I still have my hand in. The Department of Social Service and the Department of Health, they consider that I have expertise in both sides. You see, I worked in both fields, on the health side and the welfare side. So they have appointed me chairman of an appeal commission. Appeals come before the province. It could be for anything, but in health, in hospital cases, both physical and mental. But where there's difficulties about placement of a patient, let's say a patient in the hospital wants the patient out, the Department of Social Services says she's too ill or she's not well enough to be placed in one of our institutions, so it comes to down to a row between health and social services. Well, they have enough confidence in me, both sides, that they made me chairman. And what I do is we get a doctor and a nurse, usually the doctors from the health side and the nurses from the welfare side. And then we go out and to the hospitals or to it can be a home for special care, it could be anywhere. And we read the documentation and listen to the arguments pro and con, and we make a decision, and our decision is final, whether the person stays in the hospital or is suitable for home for special care or whatever the disposition is. So I do this, and I suppose I get about, what, a couple a month maybe to do. So I keep my hand in that
Yeah,
way, and I meet
indeed.
the people.
Indeed you do. Indeed you do. If you were starting again,
Yeah.
if you were going to go back to work and, you know, you were just out of school,
Yeah.
what would you think are the things that need to be done in the area of social work and social welfare?
Oh boy, that's a big question. I don't really know. I wouldn't know how to answer that because things are so complex and difficult today. You've got human rights. You've got so many difficult areas, and I just wouldn't know where to start. To be truthful about it, I think that it's much more complex. It was very simplistic when I started, but it's so complex now. I think the only answer is to get into one field and learn that, because it's so broad today. There's so many aspects and so many things. I really wouldn't know how to answer, except to say that I think you gotta get specifically trained in one particular area and do your best in that area.
Any advice that you'd give to people who are just starting out in the field?
Oh, I'm a poor fellow to give advice. I don't believe in giving advice. As you know, that's one of the tenets of our profession. We don't give advice, but I think that the thing that I admire about young people, and I was the same way myself, you were starry-eyed, and God bless them for that. And the advice that I would give them is to fight on and not to allow things to get you down. I recall early in my profession, I used to get really upset about certain things that I saw, and I used to bring it home with me and worry about it half the night. And I said to myself, you know, I'm not going to be able to live like this. And I think the one thing that I learned to do, and I think that all social workers have to learn to do this, is when 5 o'clock comes, you've got to block it out and forget about it and start again at 9 in the morning, because you won't be able to live with the profession if you can't do that. If you can't just turn it off, forget about it, and remember that you can't solve all the problems of the world, you know, overnight. And that's about it.
Okay. Well, in closing, Mr. Grandy, I wonder if there's anything you'd like to add. Any questions that you wish I would have asked?
No, not really. I think we've covered the situation pretty well as I would have seen it. You know, I don't know. You know, we could talk forever, and there's so many, you know, you can get into specific things, but I really think we've covered pretty well everything that I'd like to talk about.
Okay. Well,
Okay.
in conclusion then, I want to say thank you very much for spending time with us this morning. It's been very enjoyable for me, and
Well,
I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I hope it's been of some value to you.
I'm certain it has.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye. There we are.
Mhm.